Good evening. It's nice to welcome you here, and I welcome everyone watching from home with us through live streaming from Facebook or later through YouTube. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Theo Howard, who is the evangelization coordinator for the Archdiocese of Southwark, employed here at the Centre for Catholic Formation. He will be speaking to us this evening about the aesthetics of late Baroque and Rococo architecture, especially in the Germanic heartlands, where the Catholic faith has had such a deep evangelization. And this is a great joy for me to be at this lecture this evening. I was some years ago in Heiligenkreuz in Austria, and was absolutely bowled over by the energy of the architecture, all of the swirls and this sort of great fantasy, and it's so powerful, and it immediately whisks your mind up to the celestial realities, whilst at the same time rooting you in a sense that heaven has come down in the incarnation to meet us in history. So I'm very excited to learn more about Rococo architecture, and I therefore hand it over to the expert. Thank you, Theo.
Well, thank you very much, Sebastian, and can I just extend that welcome to new visitors to the Centre for Catholic Formation. I know we're in the wilds south of the river, but as you probably found tonight, we're not too far away from the tube station, so please mark us on your maps and return for some of the talks that we'll have for the rest of the summer term, and indeed in the future. So, as Sebastian very vividly illustrated there, I'm going to be talking about the Rococo pilgrimage churches of Bavaria. And I think to start with, it's worth saying that to just elaborate on the context in which this great flowering arose, Bavaria in the 18th century was one of the largest states in Germany, a very prosperous electorate whose rulers and people shared a taste for cheerful splendour. And in the Rococo, which was then the prevailing international style, they found just the right way to express their Catholic faith. And the result was this tremendous flowering of architecture and art in a dazzling series of both secular and religious buildings, many of them set in spectacular alpine landscapes. Now, I say international style, but nowhere did Rococo, from the French rocaille, defined by the asymmetry of its shell forms, developed more exuberantly than in Bavaria. This was the height of the Rococo style. However, Rococo hasn't enjoyed always a very kind reputation for posterity. In the same way that Baroque was seen as little more than a late and degenerate form of the Renaissance until the late 19th century. So the Rococo has long been viewed as a final and corrupt phase of the Baroque. And I think our own northern sensibilities make us have an instinctive wariness to this kind of flamboyance. I remember when I was visiting some of these Bavarian churches, distinctly hearing over my shoulder an English voice say to her companion, "Oh, it's all very nice, but it's a bit over the top, isn't it?" And these negative connotations carry over into scholarship. For example, the definition of Rococo offered to this day by the Oxford English Dictionary says, quote, "having the characteristics of Louis XIV or Louis XV workmanship, such as conventional shell and scroll work and meaningless decoration, excessively florid or ornate," end quote. Rococo in particular, but also Baroque in general, has long been dismissed, even contemporaneously by the intelligentsia. Diderot's Encyclopédie calls Baroque a nuance of the bizarre, that of the ridiculous carried to excess. Sadly, I think this opinion remains widespread today. Arnold Hauser is not alone in interpreting Rococo as the art of a frivolous, tired and passive society, a last expression of a disintegrating old order. And when we think about the time of the late 18th century, we have this image of this decadent world where bewigged aristocrats are just partying away the remaining time until they ascend the steps of the guillotine for it to all go up in flames. But I really want to disabuse you tonight of this notion of the decadence of the Rococo. I think it becomes between the conflation of the secular French Rococo and the religious Bavarian Rococo, and I want to just distinguish those two expressions of the art style. Conventional wisdom says to us that in a successful work of art, nothing should be superfluous, while it should be impossible to add anything without weakening or destroying the whole. Excess is to be avoided. We have the expression, less is more. Well, try telling that to the Bavarians. There is hardly any other style I can think of which is as intoxicated with ornament as the Rococo. So we have to ask the question, how is excess measured, and by what standards of taste is Rococo found tasteless? I think more often than not such objections are not simply to the aesthetics, but to the society from which they sprung, which I alluded to. So while Rococo's origins lie in France, indeed the word is of French origin, it reached its greatest height in Germany, mainly because it was here that it made its way into the religious sphere. And that's what we're going to look at tonight. So what happened is that Italian decorative painters of the late 17th and 18th centuries, men such as Giovanni Battista Tiepolo, migrated into Catholic Bavaria and Austria and inspired the extraordinary Rococo churches. This is Steinhausen, in which painting, sculpture and architecture lose their separate identities and flow into a riotous, light-filled ensemble. The builders of the Rococo churches in Bavaria were seeking a quest, and the quest was a kind of alchemy. It was a quest to dematerialize architecture. So in my talk tonight, I'm going to suggest 3 points. The first of these is that these churches speak of the reality of faith as celebration, and that is through the participation of the faithful. Harris, the art historian Carsten Harris, talks about Theatrum Sancta, sacred theatre, and William Park said that, quote, to the Bavarian people, the art celebrated the gaiety and joyousness of redemption. The historian Henry Sear says, nowhere does the Baroque express the joyousness of Catholic faith more exuberantly. In sumptuous fantasy proclaims the nature of religion as celebration. And of course, if we are partakers in the divine life as children of God, then we are partakers of pure joy and celebration. And this takes on a further dimension when one considers that Catholic Bavaria in the 18th century was a land of pilgrimage, which is of course a very incarnational form of participation in our religion. And this echoes the movement and dynamism of the Rococo. It's no accident that the churches that are the greatest expression of the Rococo style are pilgrimage churches, and they encourage that movement. Carsten Harris says that by shifting from a Baroque perspectival system, where art is viewed from fixed positions, to a dynamic operation of space, the Bavarian Rococo church reveals profound devotion in what appears to be aesthetic play. And that's where I think the misperception and the conflation with late 18th century French decadence comes in. This is a point I was making to a friend of mine, and that is that no single generation of Christian art has ever been able to express the entirety of the beauty of the faith at once. So you have the awe in the face of the majesty of God in the Romanesque era, the mystic ascension to heaven in the Gothic cathedral, the clear light of the insight of God as seen in the light-infused buildings of the Renaissance, and then the simple piety of the paintings of the Nazarenes, for example. Well, what the Rococo era declared was the joy of the Christian as the main subject of its message, the joy of the redemption, and the joy of the baptized who is a child of God. The sacred art of the Rococo era centres on the joy of the gospel, the Evangelii Gaudium, proclaimed for the first time by the Christmas angel to the shepherds. Secondly, I want to look at this question of Rococo being the last great period style of Catholic art. Why is this? Henry Sear says that the Catholic German lands of the 18th century were the last place that the natural development of a Catholic society could be found, and the Rococo is the artistic proclamation of such a society, a united society. Harries also agrees that the Rococo is the last of the great period styles. I think this question deserves closer examination. What does it tell us about the interaction between culture, faith and art? And then lastly, I would be remiss not to say something on the Bavarians' deep Marian piety and its realisation in the Rococo churches. In these churches, Marian iconography coalesces with the Bavarians' love for their native mountains, meadows and lakes in what Harris calls a Marian naturalism. Nature becomes a figure of Our Lady, of the paradise of the new creation to come. But again, it is mistaken to see this as an aesthetic preference for organic forms, but instead the Marian naturalism of the Rococo church is a characteristically delightful expression of our redemption. So in order to explore these points, I will focus on the examples of two Rococo pilgrimage churches which I visited in the spring, and these are Wieskirche and Steinhausen, which you see here. And these are the two masterpieces of the Zimmermann brothers. So they are Dominicus Zimmermann, who was an architect, and then Johann Baptist Zimmermann, who was a stuccoist and a painter. And these two brothers worked in partnership through much of the Bavarian Rococo. And I think you can see the depth, the closeness of the collaboration in their output. So to come back to that question of our own slight bewilderment and maybe even alienation in the face of so much ornamentation and flamboyance, Harris says the modern visitor, no longer at home with the tradition in which these churches have their roots, will find it difficult to respond to such play. I said that aesthetic play, it's called Schauspiel. In a Rococo church, we find ourselves somewhat in the position of someone who hears a poem in a language in which he only understands a few words. Given this difficulty, we are likely to respond in a way which is most readily available to us. So we experience the church as an aesthetic phenomenon, and this spiritual dimension is neglected. And above all, it is this dimension I will attempt to unfold and expose tonight. So, first of all, a little bit about the development of the Rococo. We all know about the Baroque churches of the Counter-Reformation, which incorporated curved architectural forms and spatial illusionism, particularly in Italy, in their design to stimulate piety amongst the faithful. So you have Federico Borromini's 17th century Roman churches, San Carlo alla Quattro Fontane, the Oratory of St. Philip Neri, the Church of the Gesù is the first real Baroque church, which uses spatial dynamism to metaphorically visualize the spiritual passion of the believer. Well, the Rococo, the Bavarian Rococo, derives much from a French-inspired conception of the elite, which is to say secular interior, that also insists upon this movement, which to register its full visual and semantic content. And this is the Salon de la Princesse in Paris. Marian Hobson says, quote, "The shifting planes of the room's material surfaces, which vary from glass to mirrors and to painted and gilded woodwork, to oil paintings, invites the eye to bounce from surface to surface in unsettled, disrupted, yet potentially highly pleasing sensual permutations." So this is in the Hotel du Soubise. This was a salon for aristocrats. So Marian Hobson calls this quality papillotage, from the French papillon, butterfly. It arouses this effect of a flickering, which is reminiscent of a butterfly's wings, which is stimulated from this constantly shifting perceptions of light, surface and space. So it's this motion again. It's central to how a Rococo room, such as the Salon de la Princesse, achieves papillotage. The Rococo aesthetic principles invite movement, and rely upon it to achieve their fullest effect. So given this thesis on the application of Rococo ornamentation, it seems a great distance between an urban French salon and a rural German pilgrimage church. These are different worlds, even though they're contemporaneous. However, the connection is that many French architects and designers relocated to Central Europe when they found great patronage from the German nobility's fondness for French decoration in particular. And a key figure here is the architect François de Cuvilly, who became the court architect to the Elector of Bavaria. And then what's important for us is that Johann Baptist Zimmermann worked alongside Cuvilly on various projects in Munich. So, a little bit about the culture of 18th century Bavaria. These are current just normal secular dwellings in the villages of Oberammergau, which is famous for its passion play, and Mittenwald. And these are some of the sort of expressions of Rococo as folk art that survive to this day. So with the recovery of Catholic southern Germany following the absolute devastation of the 30 Years' War, I think something between 25% and 30% of the German population perished in this cataclysm. In the 18th century, there was a great period of peace and prosperity. And this was accompanied by a great flurry of ecclesial building. And this is the twilight years of the Holy Roman Empire. So you have the ecclesiastical governments, which are very much part of the Baroque culture. So these very unique conditions allowed the theatrical culture of the Rococo to thrive in Bavaria as in no other part of Germany or even Europe. Also, by the way, these conditions made Bavaria inhospitable to the secularizing tendencies of the Enlightenment. There was no vigorous middle class. There were cities, but for the most part they remained small. And as I say, Henry Sear says these conditions are the last natural development of a Catholic society, the last example. Bavaria remained a land of peasants, essentially. There are accounts of a Protestant visiting Bavaria in 1785, and he felt, not altogether without reason, that the clock had been turned back 150 years. Travellers into southern Germany noticed that the number of calvaries and shrines that sanctified the rose actually increased as one crossed the Alps from Italy. And the church, especially the large monasteries, still dominated the economic and cultural life of the country. More than half of the Bavarian land was in its possession. The church retained a popular base. Most of the parish priests and monks, for example, were of peasant stock. And this was known as the Pfaffenwinkel, which is the priest's corner, known by that name to this day. So it's a landscape thick with a tapestry of monasteries and priories. Here's an example. This is Ottoboy, and it's a comparatively very small town around this vast monastery and cloister. In their own time, Edmund Burke wrote, quote, "It is not easy to find or to conceive governments more mild and indulgent than these church sovereignties," end quote. And then a German contemporary, Baron Riesbach, observed that in these states, quote, "they know nothing of the heavy taxes under which the subjects of the temporal princes so heavily groan," end quote. About half the year was taken up by religious holidays. In one area of Lower Bavaria, there were no fewer than 204 days on which work was forbidden. So this helps to all explain why the Bavarian Rococo church never lost its popular base. Churches like Steinhausen and Marian are the work of local craftsmen who remained very much a part of peasant society. For example, the case of the village of Weserbrunn is instructive. We know of well over 600 artists, including the Zimmermanns, who came from this one village. They were decisively involved in the creation of every aspect, every masterpiece of the German Rococo. And this wouldn't have been possible without the Benedictine monastery in Weserbrunn, in whose shadow most of these artists were raised. With a scarcity of land around the village, the monastery encouraged many of these subjects, these very simple peasant people, to become masons and stuccoers, then employed them and helped them to secure commissions further afield. At the same time, it helped to educate them and saw to it that they knew about the latest developments in art from Italy and France. So I think that the point that I want to draw from this is that, like the Gothic, the Bavarian Rococo church ignores the split between high and popular art. And the extant Rococo painted houses here are an expression of that. it ranks among the best art of the 18th century, and yet it remains in a profound sense folk art. It owes this to the integrative power of the church. It unites all segments of society, and contrast this with the urban and courtly art of the Renaissance that preceded it, and with the bourgeois-influenced neoclassicism that was to follow it, which has introduced a rift between popular art and folk art and high art that is with us to this day. So Harris says that, quote, "The Bavarian Rococo makes a last successful attempt to build churches as signs of the invisible universal church. The playful way in which this sign is established shows that it is indeed a last attempt," end quote. So the Bavarian Rococo church presents itself to us as something of a splendid, almost medieval anachronism. It still presupposes this medieval figural understanding of reality that in the more progressive parts of Europe had been rendered impossible by the Reformation and by the new philosophy of science. Its beauty can still be understood as a symbol of the beauty of heaven, or that of the bride of whom the Song of Songs and the book of Revelation speak, the beauty of the Blessed Virgin Mary. So this is the church, the abbey church you just saw there on the inside, the Otto Beuren Basilica Kirche. It's one of the largest Rococo churches. And this is going to be quite helpful to establish a very important aspect of the Rococo, which is the pictorialization of ornament. So what is the artist trying to achieve here? Well, in Rococo, ornament is used in denial of its two-dimensionality, and it's to deceive us into thinking that the stuccoed balconies actually bulge out towards us, and ornament becomes picture. So you can see that particularly in this intermediary zone here of stucco, where between the cupola and the pillars of the architecture, we have this pictorialization of ornament, which leads to a pictorialization of architecture. The supporting ceiling becomes a sky, and this ornamental treatment has the effect of lifting the tectonic weight of the architecture. The architectural elements are playfully transformed into ornament, and then ornament in turn assumes a pictorial quality or claims for itself the part of architecture. It's all quite difficult to see. But these playful metamorphoses joining architecture, painting and ornament are among the most characteristic features of the Bavarian Rococo. So in architecture we talk about tension, and the stucco, the ornament, plays the part of mediating the tension between architecture and picture, and that's the most important function. So you can see it here really, just breaking up the definition and the division between the fresco and the architecture. And this mediating role prevents ornament itself from becoming fully pictorial. So what's the effect of this mediation for the faithful? The effect is for this world and the world above, as Sebastian mentioned at the beginning, to flow into each other. Something known only by faith is made visible. So the boundaries between our temporal reality and the transcendent blur. The fresco is experienced something like a hole cut into the vault that permits us to glimpse the heavenly realm. This is the descent of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. You can see Our Lady in the centre there. So what appears is not as a second world paralleling our own, but as the extension of our world into heaven. And this was really driven home for me when I saw this delightful little side chapel in Otto Beuren. So the artistic technique of trompe-l'oeil also helps achieve this effect. This is illusionism to its greatest degree. So in this side chapel, what you see here is this is an apse above the altar, and these putti here are painted fresco putti, but the putti in the middle is stucco sculpted. So what you have is the painted putti passing the garland of flowers out of the picture and to the stucco there, and it takes a while to actually register that with the naked eye. It's so sophisticated, and again, it's this breaking out of the pictorial space is joining our worlds to the celestial realm. So here's the first church that we're going to look at in more depth, which is the Wieskirche, the most famous and enchanting of all the pilgrimage churches in Bavaria. You can see its simple exterior, painted white, gives no hint of the splendour of the interior, which demonstrates how perfectly the Rococo, invented for sophisticated Parisians, could be transposed and adapted for use in a country church here. It's totally in keeping with the beautiful surroundings. So the Wieskirche means the church in the meadow, and it's located in a rural area of southern Bavaria. So it was built as a pilgrimage church between 1745 and 1754, which is sort of the apotheosis of the Rococo in Bavaria. And as I say, its beautiful design is the combined work of the architect Dominicus Zimmermann and his elder brother, the painter and stuccoer Johann Baptist Zimmermann. They achieve in the Wieskirche an incredible lightness and a certain dematerialization of substance that you're about to see. So the question I want to look at here on a theological plane is, does this spatial permeability advance an eschatological theology which relates to its function as a pilgrimage destination? So
Something a little bit about why this church was built. This is known formally as the miraculous, the church of the Scourged Christ, and this is the miraculous statue of the Scourged Christ, which is the centre and object of the pilgrimage. So this is the story. In 1730, the abbot of Steingarten, which is the nearest sort of monastic town, had introduced the Good Friday procession into the area. And for it, he needed an image of the flagellated Christ. And it was all very hastily done. He found in an attic with paraphernalia, a head, then a chest, arms and feet. And the parts didn't really fit together at all. It was really folk art. And rags were used as stuffing, and the whole was covered with canvas and then painted. And for 3 years, this simple image was carried in the procession until something better was demanded and the statue was stored away. And then at this point, it was given to a local innkeeper, and his cousin, a peasant woman named Maria Lowry, who lived an hour's distance from Steingarten, in De Wies, in the meadow, begged him to let her have the statue. And then a month later, she found tears on Christ's face. When the miracle recurred, the terrified woman called her husband, and this miraculous event led to pilgrims flocking to the area as word spread to venerate the holy image. And a simple chapel was built, and soon there were miraculous cures. So the growing throngs of pilgrims quickly exceeded the capacity of the small, simply decorated chapel at Steingarten, erected in the early 1740s. And interestingly, records suggest that the monastery at Steingarten appears to have not been at all pleased with what was happening out in the meadows. Was it not the 18th century? The monasteries were at the forefront of a rather modest Bavarian enlightenment. But on some days, several thousand pilgrims arrived from as far away as Bohemia, the Rhineland, and Switzerland. And this success translated into funds, so the abbot decided to build a large and costly church in the prevailing Rococo style. And the peasants to whom the church owes its origins contributed their labour. So that is the statue close up, just above the altar. And this is the perspective of the pilgrim as they first enter the church to venerate the image, and as they look across to the high altar. And so also I'd like you to notice, although this picture doesn't suggest it too much, the only area of darkness is the niche for the image of the flagellated Christ, which bespeaks the darkness of that moment in our Lord's Passion. But everything else is incredibly light and airy. This is the paradigmatic Rococo church. And I'm going to just quickly mention that the triple structure that I've alluded to that defines the Bavarian Rococo church. First of all, a central space is formed. This is oval in design. You can't really see it here because I've pointed the camera upwards. And this is illuminated by mostly indirect light. But the boundaries of this space remain indefinite. Traditional architectural forms are then transformed, isolated and displaced. So notice how the pillars and the arches are all slightly indefinite and broken up with the stucco. And this ornamental stucco zone is then placed between fresco on the ceiling and architecture. And this point of view near the entrance is the most important. It determines the perspective of the main fresco and see the whole thing as a pictorial whole. So the vault itself possesses a real lightness which you can't really glean from just some of these photos. But it's made possible by the vault being constructed by timber, lath and plaster rather than stone.
This has the effect, the benefit of the columns that support the vault being incredibly light and diaphanous. They seem much too weak, more ornament than architecture. And this deception by Zimmermann creates the illusion of an almost weightless, immaterial construction. So the church exemplifies divine wonder from this vantage point. But the full complexity cannot be understood from here. Movement is required. So the movement is a spiritual dynamic as well, moving around the oval and towards the apse you can see in the middle of the picture, which brings different frescoes and iconography into view. You probably know that ambulatories are a common design feature of pilgrimage churches, since they allow pilgrims to navigate around the altar without disturbing the sacrifice of the Mass. So again, in this picture it's not too clear, but the ambulatory is through here, and then there's an arm that goes either side of the sanctuary to get to the flagellated Christ. So this would go on during Mass. So looking up, we see that unlike other Baroque churches that present eschatological dogma, the Wieskirche presents salvation as a process that unfolds metaphorically through the experience of moving through its interior. The Rococo is all about movement. It is more a stylistic quality manifest in the church's rocaille ornamentation, but it incites movement, and it points therefore to a particular human relationship to the divine. And you can see here the variety of the stucco is absolutely marvellous. This is the pinnacle. There you've got the cartouches and lattices, shells and scrolls, vases and putto heads, scroll work and ornament, and they're all modelled with the utmost skill. So this is looking most directly upwards at the main Last Judgment fresco of the pilgrimage church of Wies. And this is the work of Johann Baptist Zimmermann, and he's more closely associated with the Rococo than any other painter. His frescoes here and in Steinhausen are incredibly light and airy, as you can see, predominantly using pastel blues and greys. And again, the painting and decoration join to let us forget the materiality of the vaults. In De Wies, the Zimmermanns carved away and hollowed out the lower zone of the vaults to produce this hallucinatory effect. And I'd be interested in your first impressions, but for me, this was the most cheerful Last Judgment fresco I've ever seen. Over the choir arch in all parish churches, traditionally was an awe-inspiring representation of the Last Judgment, and we call this a doom in England. But Kenneth Clark said in his Civilization series, in these Rococo churches, the faithful are persuaded not by fear, but by joy. And the fresco itself lacks a kind of integrity and unity that makes it self-sufficient on its own. In a certain sense, it's incomplete. To do justice to it, one has to consider the contribution it makes to the architectural whole, which is the greatest achievement of the painter's brother, Dominicus. So first of all, I'll draw your attention to the rainbow that spans the frescoed ceiling, just here with our Lord at the apex. The large cartouches and stuccoed balconies above, just in the zone here, provide transitions that lead this ensemble of painting, ornament and architecture as a portal or a triumphant arch. So the columns, in a sense, continue with this arch that's painted. The fantastic throne that rises in the fresco just above the choir, you can see it here, just above the choir, is the keystone of a second arch, yet which is inside the first. And this is just here. This painted blue drapery echoes the first arch. And inside this arch, the columns of the high altar help to define a third arch. And its keystone is the apocalyptic lamb with the seven seals. So I have to go back. And you can see it just here, not very clearly. The lamb is just above the altar here. But this drapery is stucco, and it really mirrors the drapery of the fresco just above. You see the close collaboration of the brothers there. These three arches are meant to correspond to one another. So the iconography of the main fresco illuminates the deeper meaning. you've got it not too clear here, but two angels with open books, and the trumpeter angels below the end of each of the rainbow tell us that the throne rising above the choir arch is the throne of the last judgment. But notice the judge has not yet descended from the rainbow. Its coloured arc is still the reassuring sign of God's covenant with the earth. There still is time. Although the portal that looms up over us in the fresco as we prepare to leave the church, so going that way, bears the warning inscription, Tempus non erit amplius, there should be time no longer. This is the gate of eternity towards the top of this picture as you leave the church. The emblem of the snake swallowing its own tail, it marks this as the gate of eternity. And you've got Cronus, the Greek titan of time there. What lies beyond the time lies hidden behind the gate's closed doors. Now, why did the painting appear so joyful? Well, representations of the Last Judgment tend to oppose the glory of heaven to the torments of the damned on the other side. And the absence of the latter is surprising. Colour and composition make this a joyous painting. But how, given its theme, can we justify this joy? Where are the damned? To be sure, the judgment has not been made. Remember, the throne has not ascended to Christ. There still is time. But who are those to be judged? The answer is obvious enough. We ourselves. Standing in the church, we are necessary to complete the picture. So this is looking into the sanctuary. And the sanctuary fresco. So Harris described Rococo churches in their entirety as reminiscent of the theatre, which was very popular at the time, the opera, the ballet, in that the pilgrim, the worshipper, participates as an actor who gives life to the concepts represented in the church's decoration. De Vries is full of these surprises. So in walking through one arm of the ambulatory and into the apse proper, the sacred theatre is explicit. It's a motion-activated interior. And this was a real surprise to me as I visited. So you have the arms of the ambulatory we saw earlier on either side here. And what happens is that as you look through the side, you look up to these openings, which aren't particularly clear here. And then these align with frescoes on the opposite wall, so through here. And the camera's captured it imperfectly. But these hanging cartouches act as moving frames for art as the pilgrim moves. So these series of paintings appear in each leg of the ambulatory and correspond exactly to the three cartouches on each side. They depict individual moments from the life of Christ that depict his mercy and charity towards the suffering. So the sick, the deaf, the paralysed, the blind, the leprous, the raising of Lazarus. And they're not uniformly visible from any single point, but must be observed while moving. The effect is like a solar eclipse. The optical experience begins at one side and comes into view gradually before disappearing again as you move on. So the Wieskirche uses a fourth dimension, that of time, for its message to unfold. And they also frame or set up the relationship of the viewer to the statue of the scourged Christ, which is the object of the pilgrim's veneration. By arranging scenes of charity around the apse, the church's space three-dimensionalizes the common representation of the object of the scourged Christ, which would be found in contemporary popular prints. So one of these prints, for example, the Genaldblum, begins with a picture of the Christ statue surrounded by images of his good deeds. And in that regard, the Wieskirche's architecture resembles a devotional print, transformed into a three-dimensional space. And Christ's charity, I think, is an entirely appropriate theme for a decoration of a pilgrimage church. Divine mercy is presented to the pilgrim not as a fact, but rather as activity, something temporally orientated and present. We can only perceive these miracles when we move. Again, Harris calls this theatre. The pilgrim acts as an actor who gives life to the concepts represented in the church's decoration. Now, that was the splendidly decorated pulpit there. But you can't have noticed here, you can see that's fresco, and then his leg extended outwards is stucco. You can't help but notice a few of our little friends around the Bavarian Rococo churches. And I think, you can't count them, they're so numerous. I think even if the church were completely full, the worshippers would be outnumbered by the putti. So why are they there? And I think that the answer lies in how the Rococo church treats time. The Rococo restates the Baroque theme of morality and repentance, because we find in all the churches clocks large and small above the choir arch, but also the organ, the high altar in the fresco. And then this memento mori is joined by altars, by grave monuments, and the bones of the martyrs and saints. These are the trophies of time. But even if the Rococo church does not let us forget time, its celebration of colour and form, of the mysteries of changing light, its joyful affirmation of the visible, prevents us from taking this memento mori too much to heart. In these interiors, death seems to lose its sting. The rule of time is recognised, but it's lost its terror. It is perhaps in this respect that the Rococo church may truly be called an imago Caeli. In this world, it lets us glimpse something of a world that is not subject to ageing and death. Not that the Bavarian Rococo experienced the world as paradise, but more than most periods, I think more certainly than the Baroque, which placed so much emphasis on the gap between heaven and earth, on the unreality of this life and the necessity of preparing for the next. The Bavaria Rococo says that not all has been lost with Adam's fall, because within itself our world carries refractions, pieces of paradise. And this is a key for the countless putti in these churches. The play of these children without age points to an existence that does not suffer from the burden of time and does not know the rift between time and eternity. So these are some of the votive tablets that still decorate the arms, the ambulatories. You can see, there's still much piety amongst the Bavarian people here for the miracles attributed to the image. So this is the second church we'll look at, the pilgrimage church of Steinhausen. Again, even contemporaries found Marian piety particularly characteristic of the Bavarians. And this Marian piety is as much a renewal of medieval attitudes as something coming from the Counter-Reformation. Note that the image of the Virgin here, venerated at Steinhausen, the object of this pilgrimage, was a Gothic one. This wasn't a recent piece of art. And Marian pilgrimages grew popular in the 18th century as roads were much safer, etc. So this pilgrimage church of Steinhausen exhibits all the essential qualities for a people whose piety centres just as much, I would say, on pilgrimage as on liturgy. And the Zimmermans argue here, through this church, the image of the Virgin, the centre of the pilgrimage, should be given as gay and luxurious a setting as possible. So here's the slightly smaller Steinhausen church from the same entrance perspective. We find here something of a fully developed stucco zone again, that both separates and connects fresco and architecture. And notice the gables, these bit, projecting into the fresco, which were painted by the architect's brother, and appear to lie behind them. And this effect is supported by the stuccoed balustrades here, through which we see the fresco continuing. And notice these putti playing with these plants, which correspond to the gardens behind. In Zimmermann's art, the atmospheric sky above a landscape merges with the heavenly realm of God and his angels. Heaven is brought quite literally down to earth. I think the pastel colours hint at a sunny day in late spring. Blue is given an important role, below which we find green, grey and brown tones, below which groups of figures provide more colourful accents. You've got the 4 continents in each of the corners. It's a more clearer, direct picture here. There's again a marked contrast between the sorrowfulness of the miraculous statue, which was that high Gothic Pietà, drawing the pilgrimage to the church, and then the glory and triumph of the main fresco, but this time we follow Mary's story. So following the invocations of the Lauretanian litany, the fresco shows Mary as Queen of Heaven. She is just here, standing on the crescent moon, circled by angels carrying lily and rose, olive and palm branch, attended by patriarchs and prophets, apostles and martyrs, confessors and virgins. And then all the world, represented by the 4 continents, praises her. The fresco is uniquely original for uniting traditional Marian iconography with an Arcadian landscape. And Zimmermann's composition is airier and looser than the Baroque, and it's motivated by the intent to establish the church, especially the nave, as a figure of the Virgin. Notice each of the pillars seems to extend into the fresco. You can see here it being continued in the trees of the Hortus Conclusus. This is the Hortus Conclusus. The corresponding opposite garden is the Garden of Eden here. The Hortus Conclusus is from the Song of Songs, the enclosed garden in the east. And the Song of Songs is such a Marian text, and it's the key sacred text that inspires the fresco's garden imagery. The inscription over the cartouche above the choir, so we saw that in the Wieskirche, the corresponding one here, expresses this intent in an unmistakable fashion. It reads, Hortus Conclusus est Dei Genitrix Fons Signatus. The enclosed garden and the sealed fountain art thou, Mother of God. So that's just the inscription here. And above the inscription we see a garden that recalls contemporary 18th century parks, but then juxtaposed is another garden at the opposite end, which seems less tidy and a bit more like an English garden. And then Adam and Eve make this the terrestrial paradise. So given Aquinas', you can see it a bit more clearly there, Aquinas' definition of the church building as signifying the church, how does the Rococo church establish this signification? Well, the Bavarian church, particularly Steinhausen, signifies as the church by signifying the Virgin. This is the intention of the nave fresco at Steinhausen. Mary is to Christ as nave is to choir. Representing a garden, the fresco means both the Virgin and the church. At the centre of nearly every main fresco of the Baroque period, we find what's called a glory composition with angels and saints, and Steinhausen is no exception here. But Zimmermann here presents us with little more than a theatre in the clouds. The blue rising above the garden landscape is actually quite an earthly sky. What we see is a strange apparition in the sky with a very different and more remote degree of reality from that of the theatre of the garden below. The fresco as a whole has its centre in the Virgin. This heavenly theatre has its centre in the luminous name of God in the middle. The fresco thus may be said to have 2 centres, the Virgin and God. And then the same is true for the church as a whole. Choir and nave possess different degrees of reality. The choir fresco, which you can see here with the Trinity, is free of all landscape elements. The main fresco raises a second, idealized earth above our heads. The choir fresco offers us a spectacle set in heaven, ranged around God the Father and the Holy Spirit. An angelic orchestra is awaiting the Son. The spiritual centre of this fresco is the absent Christ. The main fresco has its spiritual centre in the Virgin. The church hints at the wedding of the Song of Songs, which is both the wedding of mother and son and of the church and Christ. So if we look at the large fresco Zimmermann painted nearly 20 years later after Steinhausen, this is a secular fresco for the Elector Max III in his palace of Nymphenburg, we see that the fresco celebrates not the Virgin, but the Olympian gods. So this raises the troubling question of how small is the step from the sacred to the secular. Zimmermann's art threatens to blur the world of Pan with the garden of the Song of Songs. The distance that should separate Christ and the Virgin from the pagan deities is not clearly manifest. Do we then conclude that such blurring betrays a superficiality, possible only when religion is no longer taken seriously? And this is the criticism often levelled at the Rococo. Are such confusions just another example of a supposed Rococo decadence? Well, I would join Harris in saying no, because inseparable from the Marian piety of the Bavarian Rococo is a sense of still being at home in nature. It is this that lets nature, we saw in the garden, the final garden, become a figure of the Virgin and of paradise, of the paradise that was and the paradise to come. This Marian naturalism helps to explain the anti-classical, even anti-architectural poise of the Bavarian Rococo church. It is not simply an aesthetic preference for organic forms. If the church means heaven, heaven is now thought of not as a city in heaven, nor as a cloudy realm, but in the image of the terrestrial paradise, that is to say, as a garden. There is little place for architecture in that garden. Adam didn't need a house in paradise. And just as paradise is not sought beyond earth, so it is not sought beyond time. The turn to nature goes along with the acceptance of time. There may be something pagan about a naturalism that recognises the power of death and yet refuses to take seriously the fall that has set spirit against nature and alienated man from the earth. But faith in the Virgin's immaculate conception and assumption implies faith that such alienation does not have the last word. It does not surprise us that in the beauty of nature, the Bavarians experienced the proximity of the Virgin. So it is this Marian naturalism that has to be kept in mind when seeing a church like Steinhausen. It justifies the importing of the Arcadian sphere into Johann Baptist Zimmermann's fresco. It expresses itself in the architecture of his brother Dominicus, in the pillars that rise like tree trunks. We're not seeing, though, an idealised landscapes. The foxes, the squirrels, the beetles and bees, the flowers, they're taken directly from the landscape outside the church. The spring of the Song of Songs has become a German spring. So, to draw my remarks to a close, I'd like to say again that the splendour of Rococo arts reveals a highly developed culture of science and education, literature and music that radiated far beyond the territory of the realm. But above all, the Rococo pilgrim churches are expressions of Baroque piety. The interior of Wieskirche could not look more redeemed. The church has at all times been aware of this joy. It's expressed in liturgy, of course, but the art of southern German Rococo presented and demonstrated it in a new manner to the believing. Harris says that the theatrical effects of the Rococo both reinforce and are destructive to the devotional aesthetics. He argues, quote, that the Rococo, at least in Bavaria, can be understood as a playful potentiation of the Baroque that at the same time implies its negation. In the Rococo, the Baroque destroys itself. Harris argues against the assertion that I have also tried to refute, that the Bavarian Rococo is more than an aesthetic game. It is merely an aesthetic game. It's part of a last successful attempt to create a genuinely religious art that knows not only about the insufficiency of art, but of the visible. It's mistaken to see the ornament as solely decorative. It's occupying an intermediary zone between framing and accompanying. It dislocates the viewer's previous sense of their relationship to the realm of nature and the realm of supernature. Ruprecht wrote that the pictorialization of the interior is the defining characteristic of the Bavarian Rococo church. Bavarian Rococo church is architecture that, in a sense, turns against architecture, that puts itself into question by becoming picture. And then finally, I've returned a number of times to the theme of time itself. And Friedrich Nietzsche said that the resentment against time is the deepest source of our angst, our inability to be at peace with ourselves and nature. And part of, I think, the love for the Rococo is a longing for what escapes us, this timelessness. And it's striking how a church like Devizes, you see here finally, despite its artificiality, belongs to nature. It's a really stunningly beautiful part of the Bavarian alpine foothills. And it helps us recapture something of the sense of respite that led the abbot Martin mayor of Steingarten to take his stone of his abbot's ring to etch words into the pane of his summer quarters right next to this church. The words he etched were these words here: Hoc loco habitat fortuna, hic quiescit cor. In this place fortune dwells, here the heart finds rest. Thank you very much.